Welcome, everybody. I'm pleased to see that we've already got quite a few people online, and it is only 2 o'clock right now. Cynthia, Stefan, Jackie, I know I said we'd start at 2, but I think let's literally just give it 2 minutes so that everybody who's logging on at kickoff time has got a moment to settle themselves. In the interim, I would like to thank you all so much for joining us, and to introduce myself. My name is Sarah Carmichael, as I'm sure you may have seen by my name. I work for Ethics Monitoring and Management Services, and I assist the EPA in an administrative capacity doing things like this. And so thank you very much to all of you again who are here to enjoy this time with us. And yeah, that takes us to 2 minutes past. So Stefan, Cynthia, Jackie, I don't know if you want to uncamera, and then Stefan, would you like to introduce our topic for today?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, the panelists, Cynthia, Jackie, and thank you, Sarah, for again facilitating and hosting the process for us. I think over the last year we've been all part of many of these Zoom and Microsoft Teams sessions, and we know often it's a technical nightmare. So thank you very much for helping and assisting us with this process. So those of you who I haven't met or haven't interacted with me in some way, my name is Stefan Besaidnout. I'm the CEO of the Ethics Practitioners Association and a member of the board. It is really a pleasure to host you this afternoon for what I believe is going to be a very thought-provoking session. It is a new year and already we are a quarter into it. But one thing that we learned last year is that the world as we know it or expected it to be was in fact very different. In this void of familiarity, we found ourselves often falling back on our personal values and purpose to navigate our way around this, what they call new normal. So this afternoon, we're going to have 2 speakers who are going to talk and discuss ethical trends that emerge from this very unique set of circumstances, and discuss the key strategic issues and trends in the field of workplace ethics. Our guest panelist is Dr. Jacqui Poltera, an ethics specialist with international experience in public, private, tertiary education, and in NGO sectors. And then we've got our very own Cynthia Schoeman, the EPA chairperson and the MD of Ethics Monitoring and Management Services. So very, very knowledgeable panelists today. And Cynthia, Jackie, thank you very much for offering up your own time. And we're looking forward to hear from you. Over to you.
Sarah, I think. Hi, Jackie.
Sorry, I couldn't start my video there briefly. Hi, welcome to both of you. Stefan, thank you so much for that introduction. And obviously, thanks to you two for being with us today. And I think the 54 and counting other people who have now joined. I suppose we shouldn't spend too much time dilly-dallying. We've got quite a lot of ground to cover. So Cynthia, I don't know if you would be comfortable to start. Our starting topic is obviously corruption apathy, something that unfortunately I think we've got a good understanding of what it at least means. So I don't know if you feel comfortable launching into that already?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, Jackie and I have had a number of conversations around not only what are the trends, as Stefan says, coming out of this crazy year we've just been through, but what are the big trends that we should be looking at going forward? What are the issues not only that ethics practitioners should be aware of, but that leaders in organizations should be aware of? And one of the big things, I think, is what I'm calling corruption apathy. And I mean, and very briefly, it's recognizing the point that we are surrounded by, I almost want to say noise, but really loud noise of ongoing reports, not least coming out of the Zondo Commission, of massive scale of fraud and corruption. And I always add, let's be very clear that fraud and corruption that we're seeing is not simply historical fraud and corruption. We're also looking at the reports around the COVID corruption. And, I'm still holding thumbs, I'm sure we all are, that there's no vaccine corruption coming out, although you never know. And the point I really make in terms of what I think is a significant trend is that the environment that all our employees are in is being bombarded continually over a long period of time with huge inputs around fraud and corruption. And so some of the questions that come out of that are, surely people are affected. And of course they are. And the question is, are organizations recognizing this huge impact, and are they doing something about it? And as I often say, the answer to those questions shouldn't be nothing. Jacqui, your views?
Yeah, Cynthia, I think you're right. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we have faced to date when we're looking at ethics management in any organization. But it's also one that we're going to face going forwards, as you say. And I think, so it's interesting, there's quite a lot of recent empirical evidence, some of which has been done in South Africa, on just how our relationships to corruption actually influence our action. So it's been found both in labs in the Netherlands, of all places, and in KZN in the field, that paradoxically, the more we loathe corruption and the more that we perceive it to be omnipresent, which we do in this country, the more likely we are to engage in petty acts of corruption. So it's called, for those of you who are interested, if you have a look at something called the taxi driver paradox, there's one of the researchers who does both the field research and the lab research talks about how often when you get into a new country, you've got a time limited drive with the taxi driver. It's a good indication for what people's attitudes are about corruption. The more they bemoan corruption in their country, paradoxically, the more likely they are to engage in petty acts of corruption like bribing police officers. And so the challenge for those of us working in ethics is to note that social norms, how much corruption we think there is, how much unethical practice we think there is, actually determines the extent to which people might be apathetic about it or turn a blind eye to it. So for those of you in leadership positions, this really presents an opportunity and a challenge to try and have a different narrative in your work environment. Start the conversation about corruption apathy, or ethical cynicism, as I call it. And that's the idea that people are just over it. They don't think that ethics can work. They've seen too many examples of where it doesn't. So I think that, those of us playing in this space and those of you working in your different work environments, you have to start having conversations with people about their own cynicism with respect to ethics. Because if you don't, you're missing a very important starting point with managing ethics, because you're assuming that people are on board. Yeah. Cynthia, you look like you wanted to say something.
No, but Jacqui, I think I'm really agreeing very loudly, although from my side, and the point I often make to organizations is I say, let's be very clear. What I call this outside noise of fraud and corruption, I mean, you almost need to, within an organization, say, what are we doing about ethics? Not simply to counteract that noise, but are we even competing well enough? Because I think that noise is probably far louder than what most organizations are doing in their organizations. And I think there are all sorts of initiatives that organizations could engage in to ensure that, as you say, those conversations are going forward. But I also think to spell out the risk, I think that the very real risk around this apathy is that spiral into lowest common denominator behavior. And it literally falls into all those very ordinary justifications of, for goodness sake, everyone's doing it. Now, I know we can get into a huge debate around everyone, but if you look at the scale and depth of it, actually, there's a point there. And so while of course, organizations should be focused on their ethics and their ethical culture, to ignore such an enormous factor in the environment is really ignoring literally the proverbial elephant in the room. And Jacqui, I'm not sure your view, but I'm finding that not that many organizations are alert to this and are putting in place, they're doing some of the ordinary ethics things, but they're not putting in something that is counteracting this noise. And that I think leads into your view of the cynicism that goes with the sort of ethical corruption apathy.
Yeah, I think you're right, Cynthia. And I think one of the things we tend to overestimate when we're doing ethics management is how important those kind of explicit ethics tools are. So your codes of conduct and your policies and your leadership strategies and so on. It's the tacit or implicit part of ethics management that's much more difficult. It's things like, how do you build an ethical culture? How do you know if your culture is ethical? What are the social norms in your profession or in your business? How do you counteract them if they're questionable? What's your role as a leader and so on? That stuff is very challenging to measure. It's very challenging to change. But if you're trying to manage ethics in a vacuum or assuming that you're just dealing with the explicit, you're missing something. So you need to have these challenging conversations to try and get people on board. Because as we all know, the starting point of any successful ethics management strategy is that people are on board with the change. They want the change. The leadership want the change. But if there's cynicism and corruption, apathy, you're going to be up against a very, very, very hard set of challenges.
And I think the other challenge that this falls into is almost that sense of feeling disempowered, of sort of throwing your hands in the air and saying, well, what can I do about it? And of course, we can answer that and say, you know what, when you're stopped for speaking on your cell phone, pay the fine. That's what you can do. And, but that sense of feeling disempowered, of feeling like there's nothing I can do that would make a difference is an extraordinarily negative space to be in. And we should be very aware that we wouldn't want our people to fall into that space. And I'm hoping we'll still get to the topic of remote employees, but around your employees being remote, where they can't just touch base and say, geez, Jacqui, I was thinking about this over the weekend while we're having that cup of coffee. So I think that this issue of, if you want, keeping ethics alive, I had a hashtag going on that for a long time, I think is really imperative, given the cynicism, given the apathy, that while understandable, organizations should be doing something about it.
I agree, yeah. Sorry, Sarah.
Jacqui, I just, in terms of our conversation, we've already touched on two of our points, obviously corruption, apathy, and ethical cynicism. And I think that, you both obviously recognized and given context of the fact that these are the challenges that everybody is facing. So it's not only a South African problem, but in terms of these and the noise that we have, how do you feel like the mockery of ethics is something that we can really address in terms of improving specifically on cynicism?
Well, again, there's sort of two ways of looking at it. On one hand, I do think of South Africans, we often feel like, I always joke that we've cornered the market on corruption. And I always say, we haven't cornered the market. There are lots of people out there being thoroughly wicked, but we have made a significant contribution. Not that that's to our credit, of course. And again, Jacqui, coming back to your point earlier of empirical evidence, Transparency International's annual Corruption Perceptions Index provides a very distressing and almost depressing result that over, I think it's been going for some 20 years, and I know I've tracked it recently over the last 10 years. South Africa's scores where 100 is fabulously ethical and 0 is like, I mean, off the scale, terrible. I mean, we're coming in at low 40s. Now, you know, I appreciate the education system might have changed since I was part of it, but, you know, that's pretty much a fail to me. But it's certainly in the lower, less ethical half. So I think on the one hand, Sarah, I think that we can beat ourselves up a bit and behave like, you know, it's almost only happening here. But at the same time, I think we've got to so consciously avoid being complacent of saying, ah, it's not so bad. It is that bad. And I think organizations should truly recognize the power they have and the power they have to influence their stakeholders both internally and externally. So I think those are big factors. And I think in terms of easy interventions in organizations, I think these are easy, I almost want to say empowering interventions, because you're not sitting there saying you may not steal and corruption is terrible. I mean, everyone knew that anyway. But I think it can be a very positive engagement around promoting ethics rather than simply the negatives around addressing misconduct.
It's also really an opportunity for particularly those in leadership positions. And I don't mean just formally appointed leadership positions, I mean generally leaders in organizations to face this head on and then to reinforce why ethics matter. So, you know, it's not just good for revenue, it's not just good for your reputation and your business, but it's also good for your staff morale. And it helps with attracting and retaining good staff. It helps with mitigating the risk of burnout. And these things are so important, particularly in the context of potentially a third wave of COVID in this country and all that comes with it.
Yeah. So
I think, you know, you're right that as South Africans, we are unfortunately overachievers when it comes to corruption perception. But again, there, if that empirical evidence is to be taken on board, you know, do what you can to try and change the narrative in your own organization. So one of the things they found is that in KZN, they put up posters saying corruption and bribery is down in KZN or something similar. And there was a correlation between the extent to which people saw that and the extent to which they engaged in corruption. It decreased. So that you can see that there's all sorts of interesting opportunities for work environments. But I think, I mean, one of the things that struck me coming back from overseas to South Africa several years ago was e-tolls. It was inconceivable in Australia that you wouldn't pay your e-tolls. Whereas here, collectively, South Africans tend to, not all, many, justify and rationalize why it is they ought not to pay their e-tolls. And the argument's often one that runs along the lines of corruption. We don't do it because we're contributing to corrupt government or whatever. Yeah. Again, I'm simplifying and generalizing, but there's something we need to look at more seriously there and take a different level of accountability for our own implicit bias, our own self-deception with respect to these things. If you don't pay your e-tolls, it is an ethical issue, arguably.
Yeah.
So I think, Jacqui, that cuts back to one of Cynthia's favorite points around lowest common denominator behavior. And I think that, you know, that really, you know, corruption, apathy, whether we're talking about ethical cynicism, it involves much of the same topic. And you two have already started to move forward into our third topic. And I suppose it's because they're also well tied together. But that of ethical leadership and trust. And I think that the tying in of trust is a very specific element that we need to look at in terms of how we cover these ethical trends relative to leadership. I don't know. Cynthia, would you like to start on that?
Sure. I mean, I often say that when we're looking at ethical leadership and trust at a level, this is patently obvious, and certainly everyone on this webinar should be well aware of this. But one of the 2 points I'd like to make is one, that can we please recognize that I often refer to trust as the primary currency that leaders need now more than ever, that leaders need to protect, to preserve, and to grow. And I literally speak of trust as a currency. But in the same breath, let me also add another factor about trust. And trust, exactly like ethics, I always say, can we be clear? This is not a commodity. And what I mean by that is you can't buy it, you can't sell it, You can't trade it. You can't delegate it. I mean, you get the picture. If you don't live it, it doesn't exist. It's not a commodity that can be traded and sold, and you get the picture. So I think from that perspective, trust is such a huge issue. And again, we would all be aware that in this time of such challenges as the pandemic, or in fact, in times of huge change in general, trust and the importance of leadership becomes even more important. And I again bring this back to the practical questions to organizations to say, I bet you got this point already. This shouldn't be news to you. But here's the question you need to answer. What are you doing to make sure that you maintain excellent trust levels in your organization? Again, I'll put in brackets remote employees. And if you don't have excellent trust levels, what are you doing to build that? And again, these should not be factors that either as an ethics practitioner or as leaders in an organization, it shouldn't be a question you're ignoring. It's core.
Jacqui, just relative to that, can I ask you to just cut back on what we just discussed with a view to saying, to what extent do you feel like the ability to grow trust and develop ethics, because they're not tradable commodities, to what extent do you feel like that's being undermined by ethical cynicism and corruption apathy? So it may not be directly a problem in your organization. You may have earned the right for people to trust your leaders, but to what extent do you feel the general lie of the land is having an impact on this?
So I think, Sarah, that's quite a complicated question, and as much as it would be challenging to measure the extent to which those kinds of external attitudes are impacting on leadership and trust. But I do think it's really important that organizations, even before they ask, the questions that Cynthia's just posed, they need to be able to ask the question, are we trusted and how do we know? And when you're dealing with questions of trust and leadership and ethical cynicism, one of the most important things is to remember the role of the leader inherently involves a level of self-awareness and critical self-reflection that we don't necessarily respect of others. So your leader has to be asking of themselves and of their organization, am I being ethical? If ethical cynicism is present in my work environment, what am I going to do about it? Who am I going to talk to about it? And again, there are entire theories dedicated, the giving voice to values approach is premised on the assumption that you as a leader need to create space for people to voice their own values, and you as an employee need to become more comfortable with voicing your values. Now, you can go into the specifics of whether that applies in all organizations and whether it applies when there's cynicism, but it is one of the ways that you could start to combat cynicism. If you let people voice their values, they're going to be far less likely to be cynical about ethics, particularly if you as the organization's leadership team can close the loop. So if you've heard, these are what we value, and we feel like when we're pursuing profit in these ways, in fact, it's quite conflicting for us and that doesn't sit well with me, what are you doing? Report back. And report back not just internally, but externally to your stakeholders. So I've just had an example of dealing with a company overseas, and this theme of trust came up. They've had 5-6 years of trying and largely failing to effectively engage the Indigenous community, where it's in an area where there's only 4% Indigenous identified people in kind of census data. And one of the big themes coming back from the community is trust. We don't feel like you trust us to do our job, and equally, they don't feel as if when they do provide feedback and they do engage in a trusting way with that corporation, that the corporation does anything. So there's no evidence of change even when there's feedback. So they're becoming quite cynical. So that's an example where the relationship between what you do with someone's trust, if it's a stakeholder or an internal staff member or a peer, matters. You need to change your behavior in response to information that's been given to you based on a trusting relationship. But equally, one of the antidotes for ethical cynicism is to open up the discussion about how can we do things differently and to demonstrate a level of trust in others.
I mean, Jackie, I think that, you made such a great point when you spoke about how do we combat these things. And I think that action is one of the most basic ways that we do it. And what form that action takes really depends obviously on the circumstances. But we've had a lovely question come in from Les or Pius, or I suppose more of a comment that I don't know, let me just share with you. It's obviously on the Q&A. And she said, it's one of the challenges that there's very little in the way of consequences. Now, accountability, obviously a huge topic. She's referenced drunken driving, where at best there's a fine, but there's no vehicle confiscation, rhino poaching, and then there's bail. And so to what extent are we driving appropriate consequences? And to what extent is this, undermining our ability to pursue the upside of some of these ethical trends that we are discussing? I mean, would anyone like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think Les makes a really big point, and Jackie and I have discussed this, that, to come back to your point, Sarah, around saying there needs to be visible action. Can I put it in the opposite, that when we're aware of misconduct and there is no visible action following that, when we've got no consequences, when accountability has disappeared in a puff of smoke, this adds to the apathy, it adds to the cynicism, and literally, as ordinary citizens, or we throw our hands in the air and say, see, I told you so, nothing ever happens. And it just has a cumulative effect of creating a more and more sort of ethically toxic environment that our employees are part of. And so I think it's a very real signal around, and one of the things that we absolutely not only can do, but we absolutely must be doing in our organization. I think if we choose to look away and not act on something, let's be very, very aware of how extraordinarily negative that is. But I wanted to also add on the point of leadership. I know there's an enormous amount of work out there on leadership and trust. But what I found, and so you can go into, there are definitions and models and formulae, ad nauseum. But what I did find quite interesting is the most recent Edelman Trust Barometer. So it's the 2021. And each of those, I think, again, they produce very nice information. And each of those trust barometers has a theme. And this last year, the theme was ethics. And what they focused on was looking at trust as being a function of competence and ethics. And when they looked at those as two primary factors, they acknowledged that ethics of the two was significantly more important in terms of building trust. And I remember at the time when that came out, I remember referencing that back to King 4, where we're looking at King 4 saying corporate governance is about the exercise of ethical and effective leadership. So I found those two mirroring each other. So we don't have to get massively complicated and have, 37 and a half academic references. I think you can bring it down to something as simple as saying that in terms of building trust, yes, you need to be competent. You need the knowledge, the judgment, the skills, etc. Some of that's quite lacking in some of our institutions. And if you overlay that with genuine ethics, actually, I'd almost put it to you, it's the magic formula. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that.
Yeah. I think obviously, you've covered that point very nicely, and I think it makes perfect sense and a very obvious way to say that accountability is plugging into both trust and leadership and bolstering both. In terms of our next top ethics trend, we're looking at inclusivity, inclusion in an era of widening divides. Jackie, I don't know if you would maybe like to start on that. I think it's a hugely topical issue. Happy to jump in there.
Yeah, I am. I think Look, I think the question of inclusion has become heated not only nationally but internationally, and there's lots of ways, different ways that you might want to cash out what inclusion means. And I know that this is an area that Cynthia has given a lot more thinking to than I have. But I mean, one of the themes that's coming up at the moment as an international issue associated with more working from home through COVID is that it's actually creating exclusion challenges, particularly though not exclusively. And I really want to reinforce that it's not an exclusively a gender issue. However, what people are finding is that women are continuing to work from home because they need to continue to provide care for their kids, which means they're far less likely to be back in the work environment, which then means they're less likely to be included in considerations for promotions than they might otherwise be. So that's one example under this broad topic of the ways in which we need to start thinking differently about inclusion, particularly if, as South Africans, we're about to go into another wave of COVID, because that means more chaos. And I know Stefan mentioned the new normal, and I think we all kind of wince when we hear it because it has just so many implications. But Cynthia, maybe you want to jump in and talk to this, and then we can have some further discussions.
Yeah, you know, I think the point of inclusion is a really, really big issue in South Africa for all the historical reasons we understand. I think it's important internationally, but I think it's especially important here. And again, there have been so many reports of saying that when you're in a situation such as we are with this pandemic, one of the effects has been to not only highlight the divides, but also to exacerbate them. And a quote I have used very regularly, so those of you who are on this webinar and who know my work would have heard it a lot, and it's by Joe Gerstant, who's a diversity and inclusion consultant. And he has this wonderful short one-liner. He says, if you do not intentionally, deliberately, and proactively include, you will unintentionally exclude. And I think that, again, the period we're in, I think that this has never been more important. I think there are many dimensions, and you know, Jackie, Sarah, I think we plan to discuss some of these dimensions, but this broad issue of inclusivity applies at all sorts of levels. It applies at the level of remote employees. It certainly applies at a gender level. There are so many dimensions to it. And again, you know, let me add to participants in general that when we were discussing the issues that we want to include in this discussion, I mean, there are quite a lot of trends that could have been included. I almost want to acknowledge that accountability could have been a whole trend in itself. But again, the issue of inclusion we've highlighted, because again, I pose the practical question to say, you're listening to this and you're saying, you know what? Stakeholder inclusivity is a big deal in King 4. We speak about ethical boundaries as being inclusive, as in including people, or exclusive. I would say it's not exclusive a la Gucci. It's around including people. And so we would acknowledge those concepts easily. We would understand that where exclusion happens, whether it's real or whether it's perception, we would understand that that is an extremely negative situation. And here we're back at the practical question is, are organizations, given the enormity of this issue, especially now, is this even part of their ethics action plan for the year? Is this something that they are assessing among their employees? To what extent do they really feel included, heard, their concerns addressed? And again, Jackie, I think you validly make the point around there being so many particular concerns. And there was such a good Harvard Business Review article on saying that women are picking up the really, really largest end of the added responsibilities coming out of a sort of working from home and childcare and the like. So a lot of issues that flow from that, but I think it's a huge deal, and again, which is why it got included in these overall trends.
And it's interesting. I mean, you've reminded me of this time last year. It was around July. I was teaching at WITS, a course on ethics, and it was all professional. So people were coming at the end of the day of work, and we'd made it available online. We did all the things that we could do in the context of a pandemic, but there were major inclusion issues because there were people working with SASA out in the middle of rural areas trying to help resolve challenges with grants. There were other people coming back from work stuck in traffic. There were those who didn't have the right connectivity. Now that's a very small example of where, even in quite an elite group of masters and PhD students, we had inclusion issues. I think the take home for those of us working in organizations is to be more mindful of, have you got any blind spots? Are you making business decisions without actually realizing that they have ethical implications? And the term ethical blindness and ethical blind spots, they're useful tools to help you think through how you make decisions. So your ethical blind spot might be the person who starts a sentence with, "I'm not racist, but." I mean, that usually that's the precursor to some racial slur or judgment that's going to come thereafter. Ethical blindness is more complicated because that's actually a time-limited inability to see that your decision has ethical implications. For example, if you're in the context of a pandemic and everything's fairly time-sensitive and you're making policy on the run and changing your business model on the run, you may not have time to do the kind of deep thinking required to actually realize that, in fact, there are ethical implications here. But there's an opportunity for those of us here today and going forward to actually look at the extent to which the decisions we're making that on the face of it just look like business decisions are in fact decisions with quite significant ethical implications. And again, it's not just a gender issue. And when you talk about our context in this country, any business decision that's made which violates or threatens inclusion is doubly problematic and ethically significant because we're coming from an environment where there's been profound and long-standing exclusion and still is. But also there's all kind of political and other sensitivities around that we have an onus on us to actually manage differently and manage with a different level of self-awareness.
Yeah, Sarah?
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I think that the issue of ethical blind spots under this heading is such a key topic, not just for us as South Africans, but particularly at this time in the world. But I was going to ask if Cynthia, in addition to that, you wanted to comment on the degree of kind of unintentional unethicality, which is not really the same as blind spots. I wondered if that was something you maybe wanted to add voice to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we would typically refer to it as unconscious bias, as implicit bias. And I think that ties in there very well. And again, at a broader level, we can say something like unconscious bias could be put under a banner of discrimination. But let's be clear that what discrimination creates is exclusion. That is the outcome of it. And hence we chose that as the broader theme that we're speaking to. And this issue of unconscious bias, I wrote an article on saying the bias might be unconscious, but I'm delighted to say that the consequences, and there have been consequences, have been real. And here we can think back to the Adam Katsavelos, that was the worst holiday he ever had in Greece, looking at the consequences of that. So, I mean, there have been consequences for that. But an interesting thought to throw out there, it's not this last Sunday, the previous Sunday, I was reading such an interesting article in the Sunday Times by Lindiwe Mazibuko, whom I'm sure you'll remember was formerly the parliamentary head of the DA. And I mean, she's just a gem to read. And she was writing about unconscious bias. And I mean, she was really very clear of saying, I understand the work behind this and the study, and that's all good. But her punchline was so powerful that can we please be aware that unconscious bias can also so conveniently turn into, oh my goodness, I honestly wasn't aware of that. And almost as an excuse to exonerate us from any blame, any culpability. And I appreciate my view at a talk I did some while ago. I appreciate my view was arguably a little blunt. And I'm saying in a country like South Africa, where this has been an issue in its worst possible form for as long as we can remember, I think that excuse is over. I think this unconscious bias, I appreciate the concept, I appreciate the issue that it is, but I think where it comes to the sensitive areas like racism in our country, I must tell you, I personally virtually don't make allowance for it. We have to have consciously become more aware of this. But I thought our article spoke to this point so extremely well.
I think you're, do you mind if I jump in, Sarah? Just quickly on that. I think that one of the points made in that article is not quite as strong as you've made it, but people shouldn't be using unconscious or implicit bias as an excuse. And I think that it isn't, I agree with you, Cynthia, and don't think it's actually that blunt. And we haven't spoken about this, so it's interesting our views align. I think unconscious bias, the name suggests that because it's unconscious, maybe you're not morally responsible for it, but you are, and you should be held morally responsible for it. And again, the onus is on us as individuals and leaders to look at where our unconscious bias might lie. So there's actually, Harvard University has an implicit association test that you can go and do. So you can go and test the extent to which you yourself have unconscious bias. And it's recently been monitored over a 10-year period to see that in Australia, and as South Africans, we wouldn't find this confusing or alarming, but in Australia, 75% of people are negatively biased towards Indigenous Australians and positively biased towards fair-skinned people. I think that we would find that those stats were quite common. And the onus is on particularly leaders to have a look at the ways in which your own unconscious bias might be operating. So it's entirely possible that as a woman, you might, despite yourself and despite being a very proud feminist, also think that women don't make very good leaders relative to men. Because socially, that's some of how we've been habituated to think. And we associate men with leadership positions and less women with leadership positions. So I think that there's lots of scope there again, Cynthia and Sarah, for us to start thinking differently about how we manage those tacit or implicit parts of ethics.
Yeah, and again, tying the point of accountability with bias, I'm sure for those of you tracked it as well, I thought it was an interesting example that now last month, the head of the Tokyo Olympic Committee has just resigned. And by the way, he was doing, to all intents and purposes, a fabulous job. Why did he resign? Because he complained in a committee meeting that women were too talkative and it made the meeting drag on forever. Now, again, I'm going to leave it to you to decide whether you find that troublesome or not. But let me tell you that he has actually resigned. And so here we're looking at gender bias. And so whereas I'm very quite firm on racial bias, I do recognize that bias in other areas. I don't think he set out to be rude and to infuriate not only the woman, as part of the committee, but of course it impacted the sponsors and the like. So I think they're very real areas. And Jackie, I echo your point. These are such valuable areas to be having conversations about, to be surfacing it and to be saying whether it is implicit bias, whether it is, our ethical blind spots. These can be very productive conversations that can move the organization forward. And here's the other bonus that can also move the individuals who are part of that conversation forward as well. And here again, I'll repeat something I've shared over time of saying that when organizations are really proactive about having ethics interventions in their organization. The benefit is, of course, not only for the organization to the extent that they strengthen ethics. The benefit is for every employee and their network. So that employee is taking it to their home, they're taking it to their community. And while you might think, oh my goodness, it's a stretch, I would add to you that that impact is that tiny little stone in the pond that is adding a positive effect in our country. And so I think these conversations can make such a positive difference, and they're positive, they can be held as very positive conversations.
I mean, I think that you've both spoken so well to the concept of inclusivity, but also to how the furthering of dialogue around ethical thinking, and actually, giving more time to thinking, giving more consideration to the implications that come from it, would support a much more inclusive approach. But just to touch on the last point under this heading of loyalty gone awry. I think it's a theme that we've seen very prevalent in this country, and it's been concerning that it should be juxtaposed, ethics versus loyalty. I don't know who would like to jump in on that.
I think just a very brief comment in that regard, Sarah, because, loyalty, of course, let's be clear, is a very sound and positive value. And we would often look at loyalty very much in the context of loyalty versus honesty as one of the core ethical dilemmas, and that's another whole story. But I do think that again, in part of the depth of thinking that we should be bringing to bear in terms of our understanding of ethics, is that when loyalty goes so far that we're looking at sort of blind loyalty and the blind trust, let's be clear that we're in a situation where we are favoring one group, our group, above others. We are in a situation of exclusion. And I think here, I'm always very wary of getting into political examples, but so I'll generalize this one. I won't add any local political parties. But, when an elected member of parliament, the elected member of parliament, of course, should be serving the citizens of the country. When their loyalty is overtly and even stated as being primarily and first and foremost to their political party above their role to the citizens, can we be clear that we're looking at, you can call it favoritism if you like that word better, but what we're saying is we are skewing our attention and perhaps the resources that we have towards that, as I say, loyalty gone awry. In general, it is not necessarily a bad thing, but when it moves into that extreme space where we're starting to favor and protect and promote and unduly look after one group above another, I think we're in very tricky terrain. And again, what we're doing is we're excluding.
And Cynthia, it's an interesting one, because one of the things we value in work environments is obedience to authority. But in much the same way as it can be a positive, so it can be a negative. And we need to look at giving ourselves as people in positions of authority and those of us who are not in positions of formal authority, permission to actually question whether obedience to authority is actually in line with what's ethical. And sometimes it's not. Exactly. And I think as South Africans, we tend to put quite a lot of inherent value on obedience to people in positions of authority, particularly where you're in a hierarchical system. And that can be dangerous, because if those in authority are making decisions that are ethically questionable, even if very well intended, perhaps because they've got a blind spot, or perhaps because they're valuing the outcomes more than they're valuing the extent to which their staff reason ethically, it can create a culture of ethical slippage where suddenly slightly ethically questionable behavior becomes the norm. And so again, there's a call, I'm giving this kind of call to people in leadership positions to think seriously about the ways in which your own expectations about people obeying you as a figure of authority could be problematic. Surely you want to invite more discussion and debate about whether in achieving our organizational outcomes, we're actually going about it the right way. So I think that, I agree with what you're saying. I think it's really important. I'm also aware we're running out of time, so I'm going to pass over to Sarah with that.
Thank you. I think part of the problem is that there is so much to flesh out in all of these. And just to recognize a comment that was raised in the questions tab is that, we've gotten Tombilan already saying, it's my observation that as people, I think I might be right in saying that South Africans are loath to deal with these issues. And this has been compounded by working from home. And I really think this gives a lot of context. I mean, she goes on to say a bit more, but I think that, Jackie, you've given a lot of context and recognition to what some of the implications of this have really been. So yeah, I hope that we have already answered that question adequately, because I would really like us to look at another very important ethical trend, the relationship between compliance and ethics in practice. And I think it's those last two words, in practice, that is so key. So Jackie, could I invite you there? Cynthia, do you want to jump in?
Sarah, can I just go back, and I think it speaks to Ntombi's point, and I know we're pressed for time, but I really think we should just pause on that, because while we have commented on the working from home, one of the trends that we really do need to be clear about is the implication of remote employees. And certainly, we're looking at remote employees here for, I think, a good while, and in many cases, probably very long term. And so I often put it under the banner of, how are you keeping ethics alive? I like Tommy's point around saying, what are we doing about human interaction? And, I'm delighted you're all on this Zoom call, but this would feel a lot better if we were sitting around drinking good coffee, even bad coffee for that matter. And so the question of that remoteness, we know it goes with the isolation and the reduction in human contact that is part and parcel of the pandemic. But what are we doing to really keep ethics alive among our remote employees? And here I'll just share, as I say, very briefly, being conscious of time, I'll share two comments. One is to say that if you look at what is the actual role of values, clearly values is a key part of ethics. What is the actual role of values in organization? Now, we could answer that with lots of different answers, but the one that I think is almost the most core is that values should be that incredible touchstone that is there and does not change with the changing times. That if your values are honesty and respect, whether it's a pandemic or not, actually that shouldn't change. Whether the market are good or bad, that shouldn't change. We shouldn't say, listen, I'm thinking about this respect. I think we've done it for years now, it's enough. I mean, that would be absurd. And so I think one approach to this is saying, are we looking at the extraordinary value that our values can fulfill in the organization? And then I'll share an unusual example or analogy, perhaps. And what this is reflective of is the extraordinary power of a truly inclusive purpose, where the organization's purpose is truly inclusive of all its stakeholders. And here the little analogy I often use is, I happen to like John le Carre as an author, and I don't know, those of you who read all those Cold War spy novels, I think I read them all. But, when the spy was, in the East and undercover, and, what kept that person connected, on track, engaged, and whatever? And in those days, we called it ideology. But actually, it was an extraordinary belief in a value system and in a purpose that was sound and honorable and ethical. Now we can debate all of that for the Cold War, but the analogy is so sound that where the organization has got this really ethical, inclusive purpose, again, recognize this is a wonderful, don't want to bring it down to a tool, but this is a wonderful approach to start building and maintaining that connection with your remote employees. And again, assuming that everything should continue as normal in such profoundly different working arrangements, I think is not a good approach. I think we have to be stepping up here and doing something more. So sorry, I took up time on that.
I think this is actually one where, Cynthia, I would suggest we go further than you've said and actually explicitly try and manage for what is, if anything, a worse situation for many employees, to try and not just live the values as you would if we were in our workspaces as we normally are, but think through the very real physical and psychological challenges of all those sort of occupational health and safety issues when one is working from home. And I think it can be quite easy to look at the physical side of that. But the psychological effects, as you've indicated, are profound, not just for particular groups, whether it's women or people in rural areas or people of different racial backgrounds, but across the board. And again, we need to be managing that differently.
Mm.
Sarah, do we have time to talk about compliance, or do you want to keep on this topic?
Cynthia, your call.
No, I was going to add to what Jackie said, because I similarly think this is such a big issue. I found two stark contrasts in the last while. I caught a wonderful TV interview with the global head of IKEA, speaking about, and I think they're a great company anyway, and speaking about the extent to which they really were consciously pursuing an added approach of care, Jackie, exactly to speak to the many added issues that have emerged out of this pandemic. But here's an opposite example. It happens to be a resignation as well. But you might have seen again last month, February last month, the chair of KPMG in the UK was on an online meeting about the effects with staff about the effects of the pandemic, and told them to stop moaning, quote, and not to play the victim card. I already added it up front. That was another resignation. And so I put these two stark differences out there of saying that care for me, I often speak of it as the neglected value, that where we really care about people, where that of course then entrains the whole issue of mental wellness. And it has raised as such a big issue around this time. And again, not that the organization is responsible for everything, but are they expanding that approach of care in a way that's appropriate? Have they grappled with this issue to say, we're in a remote situation, we understand the consequences of this, how are we dealing with this? How are we improving it and minimizing the negative effects? And I think that is so very important.
And also, what is our duty of care? What does it look like in this new situation? I think that's a very challenging question, and it's going to be different for different companies when they answer it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think in terms of actually how we have landed up closing time-wise, closing on the real challenges of remote working, on the real importance of acknowledging employees and of acknowledging care and recognizing its space in a working environment, I think is maybe a really important and practical place for us to be closing this. So Cynthia, Jackie, thank you so much. Stefan, thank you for all the introductions. Can I ask, is there anything that you would like to add? We've got a minute or so to go. I don't have any more questions that have popped up just yet.
You know, Sarah, a point I've often raised, perhaps to share as a concluding comment, is maybe I should preface it by saying that I do appreciate that in terms of this webinar, we're speaking to, so to speak, the converted, and they probably don't need much persuasion to be doing something about ethics. But you know, where I'm speaking to other groups, I always say, here's an interesting irony to consider. Can you recognize that corruption has increased the value of ethics? That we are so surrounded by this loud noise of corruption that when we encounter an organization where they do a fabulous job, they do it on time, they do it on budget, and you come out of it and you say, oh my goodness, these guys were so trustworthy, we'll definitely use them again. And whether it is around trust, whether it's around, you know, that you can use it in so many ways, whether it is around being treated fairly, that where we are seen to be behaving ethically in all sorts of dimensions, in the incredible noise of the fraud and corruption that we're surrounded by, it has extraordinary value. So as I say, my point, corruption has absolutely ironically increased the value of ethics.
Jackie?
Yeah, I agree, Cynthia. And I just wanted to, I'm having a look at the chat and I see that Richard, I don't know whether you're still there, but you've raised the point, and it's a fair point, that although we're discussing inclusion and unconscious bias as a panel, we're clearly all of a type. This is something that we actually did talk about before. We knew that this would be a risk, but we decided that we still wanted to have this conversation, Cynthia and I, given this is the first time that we've done one of these and it's the first time that we've worked together. But your point is well made, and it's something that we will certainly take on board going forward.
And may I add, as the in terms of the EPA and as chair of the EPA, can I tell you that obviously one of the EPA's value propositions is offering talks such as this to EPA members and to others who have an interest in ethics. And certainly the next 2 talks we've got planned will not reflect this lack of inclusion. Both of them are no, and it's an absolutely fair point. But as I say, certainly the next 2 have specifically recognized this issue today.
Well, then, on that note, thank you both very much. Thank you to everybody who joined us. It was great to have such a wonderful attendance on this webinar. Thank you for covering tough ethical trends. I think there's no better time than the present to start considering these more seriously. And to anybody who sent through any questions or comments that didn't get answered to, we have collated all of these, and you will be emailed back. But as you can see, we're a bit short on time, so I think we've done our best to maximize this hour. And thank you again very much for joining us. Have a good rest of the afternoon.
And thank you from the EPA as well for joining us. It was a real pleasure having you. Thank you, Jackie. Bye.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for the comments.